The Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound. We'll have a link in the episode notes for your convenience. Many of the books mentioned here in the podcast are available in Audible. Sign up for a free 30-day membership trial, and you can download any book you like. Support the Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound.
If our two eyes are not working together well as a fast, synchronized team, our internal map quest continues to be off. It's consistently inconsistent with our ability to judge time and space. Those that don't feel well grounded, those that have some measure of anxiety, oftentimes it starts in the visual system. If you can't move, look, and listen in a fast, accurate, effortless, sustainable, age-appropriate, meaningful way, you're in a world of hurt. There's a whole world in vision and how it affects brain function that no one's ever shared with you. 2020 is perceived as the holy grail of going to the eye doctor. Well, I'm here to change that paradigm. Welcome back to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast. This is Dr. Doug Stephey. I'm grateful today that Dr. Stein has agreed to come back and talk more about the magnocellular pathway, or pathways, as it were. And we're going to focus today on learning, and specifically reading disorders and dyslexia. Dr. Stein, welcome back. Glad to have you.
Pleased to be with you again.
So before we get started, I do want to acknowledge something. Do you think it's hyperbole if I say to you, you are probably the most knowledgeable person on the planet about the magnocellular system?
It's definitely hyperbole, but I'm very flattered.
Well, how about this? If we use the benchmark, has anyone published more about the magnocellular pathway than you?
Not about the magnocellular pathway and dyslexia, no, but there's a huge number of publications about the visual magnocellular pathway.
All right, we'll go with that. I'm still going to put you at the pinnacle, if you don't mind. So before we really start to launch into the topic, I just want to acknowledge something for the listening audience. I can't remember if I said this in the previous episodes, but I'm going to go on record today and say labels are for cans, not for kids. And I say that because, as an example, I'm going to use the following labels and a quick description of them. So dyslexia, in its simplest terms, means you're having trouble with reading and we don't know why. And dysgraphia means you're having trouble with writing and we don't know why. Dyspraxia, difficulty with movement and we don't know why. Dyscalculia, difficulty with math and we don't know why. ADHD, you're having difficulty with attention and we haven't explained why. So those are all labels that you've likely heard. They might apply to you or your child. And even if you've got the label, I would humbly suggest that you don't know the why well enough.
None of us know the why enough. We're all learning.
And I think that's what's so fascinating to me and why I never tire of what I do in practice, because there's always something more to learn. And the best research that we have today is just what we know today. And tomorrow it might be a different story.
Yeah, I always teach my students that our knowledge of today is entirely provisional. It has to be proven in the future or discarded.
I love that. So before we get into the reading and dyslexia components itself, I do want to clarify a couple of points. When we spoke last, I want to make sure I understood this correctly. Input to the magnocellular neurons are really from the red and blue cones. Did I get that right?
No, it's red and green cones that provide the main input to the magnocellular system. So yellow is the best color for the magnocellular system. It facilitates it.
Got it. And is the pattern glare test or similar variations of it, is that a representation of magnocellular dysfunction?
I believe so.
And I think the reason that you're seeing it in that fashion has to do with the cycles per degree, how many black and white stripes per unit of measurement?
That's exactly right. The typical spatial frequency, as it's called, is about 3 cycles per degree, and that is the peak sensitivity of the magnocellular system.
All right. So let's get into the topic of the day, dyslexia and reading disorders. And I'm curious if you have a working definition of what dyslexia is.
Well, I go back to the original definition by the guy whose name I couldn't remember last time, Pringle Morgan, in 1896, where he described a child called Percy who was probably of high oral intelligence, but for some reason couldn't read. So there are two things. First of all, he couldn't read, even though he's of normal intelligence. And the third thing that he emphasized was that the whole family couldn't read, so it was probably hereditary. Those are the three things that I think define dyslexia, but many people wouldn't agree with me. They've widened the definition, and I think not sensibly.
And with that in mind, I printed out this morning the definition, and I'm just going to read it quickly for the audience. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So that's that definition. And arguably in the last 40 years or so, there was a big swing towards the phonological component of reading.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that definition, unfortunately, doesn't explicitly make the point that there is a discrepancy between the person's reading ability and their other cognitive abilities. In fact, it deliberately avoids that because the discrepancy definition, which is what I described from originally Pringle Morgan, is not accepted now, I think wrongly.
I would agree.
Can I just add that that means that a lot of people are defined as dyslexic nowadays. In fact, almost anybody who can't read is defined as dyslexic. And that makes the label useless, really.
You know what? I agree. And I think that goes back to the discrepancy model. And the discrepancy model for the listeners today typically is there's a measurement of IQ and there's a measurement of reading achievement. And if there's a severe discrepancy between those two items, then you're likely to get the term dyslexia or specific learning disorder or a specific learning disability.
That used to be the case, but now, because of the rows about definitions of IQ, nobody uses that discrepancy.
Which I suppose makes the definition even more useless, because if I, and oftentimes do, measure reading outcomes, if I see a kid who's measurably a poor reader compared to their chronological age, all I know is the kid's a poor reader.
That's right.
It in no way explains why he's not or she's not benefiting from reading instruction. Just, I've measured a poor reader.
Exactly. And add to that the phonological theory, which says that the reason you're a poor reader is because you don't understand the phonological principle. It means that anybody who's a poor reader, whether they're high or low intelligence and whatever kind of reason, social reason, for instance, that lack of education, etc., they will still be regarded as dyslexic.
And that's really unfortunate because it colors then the interventions that child might receive and whether or not those interventions are effective or even proven effective.
Exactly. And all such children get hammered with phonology and very often doesn't help them at all. But I don't want to labor the point. That's my opinion.
Well, but it's an important one because that's the whole point of this episode today, is that we're going to get into the weeds a little bit and make it clear what's really kind of happening. And here's an interesting question, because I know what I'm going to pose to you next has been true over here in the US probably since the 60s or 70s. I don't remember the exact timeline. But we have the likelihood over here of describing a reading disordered person as a dysphonetic dyslexic, a dyseidetic dyslexic, or a dysphoneidetic dyslexic. and a combination of those two terms. Are those terms that you use over there?
I know them. I don't actually use them, but I know them. You're right. They derive from, I think, the 60s. Again, I can't remember who introduced them, but the idea is that some people have visual problems with reading, other people have auditory problems with reading, and many people have both.
Well, I think what was interesting for me is that there was a physician over here in Southern California named Elena Boder.
She was certainly one of the people who introduced those terms.
Yep. And for my recollection, those that took issue with her research wasn't necessarily the terms themselves, but how she had collected the data and reported upon it. So they attacked her, if I remember, more from the statistical standpoint with what she did rather than the terms themselves. And I think that's important because there were a couple of optometrists, John Griffin and Howard Walton from best recollection, who looked at her body of work and said, there's something valuable here. And they went back and collected a bunch of data on kids and originally came up with what was called the Dyslexia Determination Test that has been supplanted by other research that's now called it the Decoding, Encoding, Screening for Dyslexia. And it really does make an effort to parse out the dysphonetic versus the dyseidetic. And my impression over the years, not only with that research and the reading I've done on my own experience in my clinical practice, is that if you're diagnosed with dysphonetic dyslexia, that's not that hard to treat. And it could be for a variety of factors. Could be primitive reflexes, could be cerebellar based, could be auditory, could be vision, could be a combination of the above, like we've been speaking in the other episode regarding the magnocellular pathway being a defining factor in all three of those systems, motor, auditory, vision. But if you're a dyseidetic dyslexic, that's different. And I think that speaks more to Pringle Morgan's experience and how he defined it and recognized it as a perpetual problem and a strong family history of it.
Well, he called it word blindness, as was common at that time.
And I think in that regard, I think that's important to differentiate the dysphonetics versus the dyseidetics, because it really changes their treatment plan. And I think it has an ability to create more realistic expectations of what that reading outcome is likely to be. So, for example, if you're a dyseidetic dyslexic and there's a strong family history of reading difficulties, I think you could do 10,000 hours of reading instruction. And at the end of it, you're still going to be a dyseidetic dyslexic.
It depends on the type of reading instruction. If you, by that, you mean drumming phonology into them, you're absolutely right. But if you have a sensible approach to the visual side of reading, then you can help a lot.
I think you're absolutely right about that. So if you're a dyseidetic dyslexic and you've got a challenge or a problem in the visual word form area in your brain that doesn't allow for fast whole word reading, and you are likely to struggle with phonetically decoding, the one thing that we do have to do is we do have to ensure that your cerebellum and your auditory and your visual pathways are working at peak efficiency, because you've got problems enough already. We don't need to aggravate them by not recognizing the value of these other systems and training them to the best of your abilities to do so.
Absolutely, yeah.
And with that in mind, how productive is it when you don't know visual, auditory, and cerebellar or motor function? If you don't know those skills, you're a child that's been identified with a reading problem. How effective is reading instruction if you're given 2, 3, 4 hours a day of intensive reading instruction, but we don't know your basic visual, auditory, and cerebellum skills? Is that kind of reading instruction productive?
Obviously, you need to know what the child's weaknesses are in order to tailor the instruction to help him overcome those weaknesses. And if you don't know what they are, then obviously you can't do that. And what has happened is that people have oversimplified and said everybody with a reading difficulty has a phonological problem. Therefore, all we have to do is teach them phonology. It just doesn't work.
And the reading instruction in that regard pounds away at the phonological component, which won't end up being all that effective. Penny wise and pound foolish if it were.
for many of the children. I'm the last to say that it won't help some children, but usually it's the children whose reading has developed poorly because of things that are to do with their education or their social background. And very often, the ones who have a genetic basis to their reading problems are not helped by the phonological training.
Yes, I think that's true yet again. One of the things that I've found over here in the US is that I would argue that all reading research is inherently biased. And one of the reasons for it is that reading research over here only looks at decoding outcomes with a primary emphasis on phonological processing. And so there's variables like retained primitive reflexes, nutrition deficiencies like omega-3 fatty acids, millisecond timing clock problems in the cerebellum, magnocellular vision problems, binocular vision problems, whether it's ocular motor, eye teaming, or eye focusing in layperson terms. Those kind of variables are never accounted for. And I don't know how we create sufficient reading strategies and reading programs and reading outcomes when we ignore all these other factors. I just don't understand that. I never have.
I absolutely agree. But in a way, it's worse of it than this because there is a point of view, particularly in the United States, which says that it's almost criminal to take account of things like the visual system when teaching children to read, which makes no sense to me at all. But it's definitely the feeling you get when I give lectures in the States. I often afterwards accused of misleading people about how you should teach children to read.
I would agree with that. I certainly have experienced that myself. The other thing that I see problematic over here in the US is frequently, if you're a parent of a child who's struggling to learn how to read, you know this probably even before you start formal reading instruction. And it might tie into your child's ability, if you knew how to read the tea leaves of this, by the way, but it might even relate to the precursor to formal reading instruction. So if you're sitting down with your 3 and your 4-year-old and you're reading to your child, if that child really can't visually look at print for some of the reasons that we're talking about, they can't look at print.
It hurts them. It hurts some of them because the print's wobbling all over the place and giving them headaches.
Yes. So that child will avoid looking at print, or when they do, what you might see as a parent is that they're closing one eye, or they're squinting, or they're rubbing their eyes, or they're rubbing their temples as a manifestation of how much it physically hurts to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And a vigilant parent will pick this up and say, look, there's something wrong.
Well, I think you're right yet again. And then, of course, the problem is that even if they think that, and they think, okay, maybe this could be a vision problem, at least again here in the US, they take their child in for an eye exam, could be an ophthalmologist or an optometrist. And the reality is that most optometrists and ophthalmologists don't assess for what we're talking about.
Absolutely not. They'll say, oh, she's got 20/20 vision. Absolutely nothing wrong with them. Sometimes they'll look at their binocular control, though optometrists don't often do this, but they see nothing because they don't know what to look for.
Yes. So the answer that you walk away with is your kid's 20/20, they have healthy eyes, there's nothing going on visually. And then the sad reality is that when parents hear that, they then sometimes, they kind of take it out on the kids in terms of, well, you're just being lazy and not trying.
Well, that's often the case because they get so frustrated with the kids. They think the kid is being deliberately awkward. It's all too easy to do that.
You're willfully not listening to me and
Yeah.
engaging in what I'm asking you to do. And you can't do that if you look at print and it causes you blur, headache, eye strain. And when you're that young of a kid, you don't know how to articulate that. You don't have the language skills to say, well, look, Mom, I can't look at this print because it hurts my eyes to do so.
Yeah, and they don't know that other children aren't having the same problem. That's what's so mystifying for them. And of course, if you ask them if there's anything wrong with their vision, they don't know that there is anything wrong with them. They think everybody else has it.
Right. I've had kids anywhere from 9 to, let's say, 13 years of age And one of my questions might be, well, it's a handful of questions. Hey, when you sit down and read for more than 5 or 10 minutes, do the words get blurry, move, dance around on the page, sort of fade in and out, or do you ever see double? And frequently the kids will say, well, yeah, all of that happens. And if the parent's sitting in the room,
they're amazed. Yeah, that's right. Because nobody's ever asked the child. And the phonologist will say, well, the child's just making it up.
Oh, I'm speechless because it's so true. And the phonologists have so swung the pendulum the other way away from vision that there's absolutely nothing about vision that could have anything to do with reading. If that's the mindset you come in with, I'm going to be hard pressed to convince you.
Yeah, and the point is that they want to neglect vision because they know nothing about vision, but they feel confident about talking about phonology because most of them come from that side of psychology.
Well, the other thing that's interesting to me is that I believe this quote was credited to Upland St. Clair back in the 1920s or so, and it went like this. It's difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on him not understanding it.
Absolutely. That sounds like Upton Sinclair. I love his novels, by the way.
Those of us that do this vision piece, we have to recognize the tidal wave of what we're swimming against and recognize it for what it is and do what you've been doing for many years now, which is, look, I'm going to do the research and publish it. So it's hard to refute the body of work that you have done. It's powerful.
The best thing you can do is ignore it, of course.
Well, and at the end of the day, I know what I know, and I'm going to continue to practice the way I practice because it allows me to affect people's quality of life. Which brings me to this. I have a handout that I hand out to parents. It's called Stop Reading Failure. And I'm going to read you a little quote from a journal called American Educator. This is from the summer of 1995. Here it is. This we can say with certainty. If a child in a modern society like ours does not learn to read, he doesn't make it in life. If he doesn't learn to read well enough to comprehend what he's reading, if he doesn't learn to read effortlessly enough to render reading pleasurable, if he doesn't learn to read broadly and reflectively across all content areas, his chances for a fulfilling life, by whatever measure, academic success, financial success, the ability to find interesting work, personal autonomy, self-esteem, are practically nil.
Absolutely. And of course, both in this country, the UK, and in the US, about 1 in 5 18-year-olds leave school without being able to read as well as an average 11-year-old. So they're cruelly ill-equipped to cope with modern life.
And on a related note, I came across a different sentence the other day that went like this. If you've been left behind in reading for about 3 years, that you're going to have to read 8 hours a day, every day for a year to read as much as a good reader would have read in that same window of time.
Yeah, that's roughly the 10,000 hours that you've missed.
Yep. And the reason that's so important, and something that I frequently have to bring up in a school district phone call of a kid that I might have assessed, and I get the opportunity to come and share my information. And this comes from an article titled What Reading Does for the Mind. And basically it said this. If you're in the bottom 10th percentile in your reading age group, you read about 8,000 words a year for fun. So unrelated to school-related mandated reading, you read about 8,000 words in a 12-month period of time. And if you're in the top 90th percentile in your reading age group, you read over 1,800,000 words in a year. And a way to spin this, because somebody took the time to figure it out, they said if you're in the top 90th percentile, you read as many words in 2 days as the bottom 10th percentile does in 12 months.
That's about right, yeah.
And I think the point I would make, if you're a parent with a struggling reader, is you need to trust your instincts. You need to keep pushing the envelope of why your kid is not benefiting from reading instruction. And you need a more comprehensive assessment to determine the why. And the reason that becomes critical is because if you stay behind in reading, well, now the reading gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year that you fall further and further behind your peers. And by the time you get to even fifth grade, you're probably 4 to 6 million words behind your peers in successful word reading exposures. And by the time you get to be 14 or 15, you're probably 14 to 17 million words behind your peers. And that not only does that continue to affect your reading abilities, it affects your entire brain, right? Your receptive language skills are worse. Your expressive language skills are worse. Your ability to put your thoughts down in writing, apply logic and reasoning, you are way behind the curve. And there's no amount of reading intervention that's going to make up that gap. What we have to do, early diagnosis, early intervention, and give you an opportunity to read successfully and widely.
I absolutely agree. The worst feature of that is, of course, it is not done. Most systems, US and UK, wait until the child really is failing. So they've already lost 2 or 3 years of reading.
I would agree. And then that goes back to that. Well, now you got to read 8 hours a day every day for a year, try to catch up. And nobody's doing that.
A child who can't read won't do it.
Simple enough. One of the things that has been really intriguing to me over the last number of years, and I wasn't smart enough to figure this out. I had a patient tell me this, and I have ran with it every day since then. I'm convinced that you have a binocular vision problem unless you convince me that you don't. And when I say convince me, I mean that I'm going to measure aspects of eye teaming, eye focusing, and eye tracking, because I'm going to presume you have that problem. So until you prove to me that you don't, I'm going under every assumption that you do. And the reason that's important, because frequently I'll pull out a textbook, I'll give it to somebody to look at, and I'll say, so here's the question. When you look at this page of print, are your eyes more attracted to the words on the page or the white spaces between the words? And if you've got the kind of vision problems I'm fishing for, invariably, these people start to chuckle because they're like, oh, no, I'm looking at the white spaces. Well, how are you going to get better at reading if you can't even look at the words? And what's striking to me in that context is the amount of people that I might show a colored lens and or a prism or a low plus lens to, or some combination. And honestly, it's like a light switch. I put the lenses on and they say, oh, I'm looking at the words. I take the lenses away. I'm looking at the white spaces. Words, white spaces, words, white spaces.
You know why that is? It's because they find the white spaces easier to focus on.
Which goes back to the vision piece.
Yeah.
When reading experts say, to reiterate, vision's got nothing to do with reading, I want to say, if that's true, would you mind closing your eyes and then I'm going to have you read this book that I'm going to give you? It's just preposterous. But that is the fight that we continue to fight. So you have a charity called the Dyslexia Trust. Do I have that right?
Dyslexia Research Trust, yes. I set up the charity 25 years ago because it was so difficult to raise money for visual problems in dyslexia. And, it's been going on and ever since then. But of course, it's difficult now because our main source of income is helping people with visual problems. And it's difficult to do that when you can't get close to them.
Can you briefly describe the kind of testing that you do when you're doing an assessment on a reading disordered adult or child?
Well, remember that we're known for visual problems. So everybody who comes to us is already suspicious that their child has visual problems, or we see quite a few students as well. But the first and most important thing is to take a detailed visual history, which includes the visual development or the motor development and any problems that appeared during early development, in particular, late walking, odd crawling, that sort of thing, abnormal coordination, therefore. And when we come to look at we ask about symptoms, in particular, whether they see the letters moving around, whether they get eye strain and headaches when they are reading, or, of course, double vision. And then we examine their eyes in what we call an orthoptic way. So it's not optometry. We, of course, measure their visual acuity, but that's almost always normal. But we're particularly interested in binocular control. So about the cover test, for instance. We use the cover test to look for latent squints, and we measure the eye movements using an eye movement recorder, and we look for binocular, what we call binocular instability. That's when you're trying to fixate, not at a letter or anything, but let's just say a small cross. We record the eye movements, and where most people, our eye movement recorder can pick up what are called microsaccades, where most people have small microsaccades, but they're always returned to the fixation cross. In the case of children with fixation instability, the eyes just move away and don't come back. And so the child is all the time fighting with the problem that the eyes will willfully move off the letter they're trying to look at. Then we will try our colors, either blue or yellow. That's a very short account of what we do. So it's an orthoptic examination culminating in seeing them whether blue or yellow help.
And you do motion coherence in that as well?
We don't usually nowadays do motion coherence. And if you want me to talk about that now, I will. I know I was going to, but we don't normally do it because in children, we found it isn't as helpful as we hoped.
Well, I'm presuming that if the yellow or blue does help, you'll prescribe that.
Yes, in plano spectacles, without any prism.
If it doesn't help, what do you do?
Well, there's many things that we can do. In particular, if the child happens not to have visual problems, then we will introduce them to the kind of techniques that we found help children with what you'd call dysphonetic dyslexia. That is to say, not too much hammering phonology, but rather teaching them to associate the visual look of words with the sounds, the visual look of whole words with the sounds. We also, if necessary, and we find that there's a real problem with the auditory sequencing, we give them exercises in auditory sequencing. I think you mentioned the metronome test last time we talked. We do something like that, yeah. Of course, the other thing is we advise them to give the children supplements of omega-3s, the long-chain omega-3s.
Yep. If they are identified as having binocular instability, do you do exercises to train that?
If neither the blue or the yellow work, and we use convergence exercises, in particular using physiological diplopia. You know what I'm talking about?
I do.
I could explain it.
Go ahead. Let's take a moment and explain physiological diplopia.
The principle of this is if you look at a point close to, then anything beyond you, you will see double, and anything closer to you, you see double. So what the idea is to let the child look. We actually use two clowns, one with a wand and the other with a sort of flag. And if you get the child to look at a point closer to, and then you show the clowns beyond the subject, what the child sees is two clowns. And then what you try and do is get the child to move so that he's seeing only one clown by moving the card to and fro from the person. And that way you train the convergence system to fuse at different distances.
And I like the expression, neurons that fire together, wire together.
Yeah.
And my point is that if your eye movement control, if you don't know where to look, when to look, or how long to look for, your brain has to spend way more mental energy on trying to figure out how to control your two eyes and where you're paying attention.
Yeah.
It would act as a drain on your other cognitive abilities. Make sense?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Convergence exercises are quite difficult for young children to do. That's the problem. Or that it's difficult to get them to it, which is why some people help them with prisms. We think that is not a good idea because actually that relieves the natural system from learning how to do it.
Yep. Well, with having said what we've done today, I think we've done a decent job of explaining a little bit further about the role of the visual system, in particular in the reading disability field, specifically dyslexia. And with having said that, I just want to reiterate, if you or your child suffers a reading problem, I'm going on record and saying that you've got some undiagnosed and untreated vision deficits. So keep looking and come back to the podcast. I'm going to put some things at the end of the show notes about how to find doctors like Dr. Stein and myself, and keep looking. Dr. Stein, thank you again today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey. All of the resources mentioned in this podcast and links to learn more about our guest can be found in the episode notes from whichever podcast app you might be listening with. You'll also find a link to Dr. Stephey's website, which is stepheyoptometry.com. That's STEPHEY optometry.com. You can also call the office at 626-332-4510. We'd like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, Audible. If you love podcasts, you'll love listening to audiobooks with Audible. Many of the books mentioned here in the podcast can also be found at Audible. Dr. Stephey has a free audiobook waiting for you as a gift just for listening to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast. Simply click the link in the show notes to audibletrial.com/inbound. Sign up for a free 30-day membership trial, and you can download any audiobook you like. And if for any reason and at any time you choose to cancel your membership, you get to keep all of your audiobook downloads. It's risk-free and for free for 30 days. Support the Move, Look, and Listen podcast by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound. We really do appreciate you listening. And until next time, for Dr. Stephey of the Move, Look, and Listen podcast, I'm Tim Edwards with the Inbound Podcasting Network.